I'm Rachel Wearmouth. I'm a political correspondent for the Daily Mirror.
I'm Sebastian Payne, white editor of the Financial Times, and crucially, not for the first time, I've written a book on the Red Wall, which is called Broken Heartlands, A Journey Through Labour's Lost England, available in paperback now in all good and bad bookshops.
Anthony.
My name is Antony Higginbotham. I'm the Member of Parliament for Burnley, first elected in 2019, and took the seat for the Conservative Party for the first time since 1910, so very much part of that Red Wall.
Morning, I'm Haigh. I'm the MP for Sheffield Heeley and the Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, and I just ran the by-election campaign in Wakefield for the Labour Party.
Indeed. So first, I guess I'll go around the panel and ask everybody, what do you think really defines a Red Wall seat?
Well, very handily, I've put 4 tests down in the book, second mention, about what that is.
I'm allowed to ban this.
No, exactly. No, I'll stop now, I promise. It also means you don't need to buy it, because I'm just telling you this all anyway. So the key point about the Red Wall is it's not just seats the Tories won for the first time at the last election. The way that I defined it is for 4 metrics. Number 1, it had a heavy Leave vote, so well over 52%, which was the national average. 2, it hadn't had a Conservative MP since the Second World War, in many cases ever, in case of Grimsby and obviously longer in terms of Burnley, which I wrote about. 3, it always had a significant but consistent but small Tory vote, i.e. 5,000 to 10,000 vote share. And there's a 4th one, I'm trying to remember what it is now, but it's very, very important. So I should have read the book before I came back here. But the point about them is they are all contiguous. They are all geographically linked. They share an economic profile. They are often former post-industrialised places. They are often towns. And they are places that fundamentally, if they were in different parts of the country, they would have gone Conservative a long time ago. They are very analogous to what you may see in Kent or Essex. But because of the historical link to Labour, they've never gone that way until we saw the 2019 election and the general shifts that have been taking place over the past 40 years in terms of their economic base.
Anthony.
Yeah, I think I would agree with what Seb said. Brexit was a big dividing line between what we would constitute as the Red Wall. And I think Seb's also right that 2019 wasn't a one-off shift. If you look at all the seats that we would now consider part of the Red Wall, they were shifting from, in Burnley's case, they've always flirted with the Conservative Party to varying degrees, but 2017 became another high watermark, and so it was just getting over that line. It wasn't, I think sometimes we like to frame the Red Wall as though it was this very unusual event. These were people who never voted Conservative, and that just isn't and wasn't the case. These are people who, in communities like mine, there has always been a strong Conservative voter bloc. It's just they never got over the line. And Brexit, I think, made some people start to reflect on how they were voting. And so it was that kind of reflection that then took us just over the line and allowed a Conservative to get elected.
I imagine Noel will have a very different take.
Well, I mean, Wakefield would have been considered a very typical Red Wall seat, according to Seb's definition. And I don't know what your 4th one is. I will read your book.
I've just remembered it, by the way, which is massive Labour majorities, consistently, particularly 5 figures since 1997.
Since 97, OK. So I would have guessed another thing that really unites so-called Red Wall seats is a slightly older than average population, and that was certainly true in Wakefield. But what I think, and although Wakefield did return a sizable majority in 1997, as Anthony's just said, its majority had been diminishing since sort of 2001, really. And since 2005, it hadn't returned a Labour majority of more than 3,000. So that result last week was really quite significant. To return a majority of almost 5,000 on a suppressed by-election turnout with a 12.7% swing to the Labour Party tells us that we are making inroads back into that demographic. But Wakefield's a bit more, and I don't like the term Red Wall because I think it masks much greater subtleties, and it over-characterises and over-stereotypes a demographic of voter that I think can be talked about quite patronisingly from Westminster. But Wakefield went beyond, I think, in terms of those demographics of what we sort of characterise as a red wall, because as well as the city itself and a very traditional Labour vote that voted overwhelmingly to leave the European Union and then went Tory, it's also made up of smaller market towns that were very, very traditional Tory voters. And as well as winning back those 2019 voters, as we did last week, we actually made inroads into those very traditional Tory voters as well. And for the first time, basically, in my political life, I was hearing people who'd voted Conservative for many decades, in some instances for their entire lives, and were voting Labour for the first time in their lives. So as well as making inroads back into the red wall, I think that victory in Wakefield should give Conservatives across the board real concern for the next general election, because a lot of those voters are now in exactly the same place as our lifelong Labour voters were in 2019, of making that switch positively to the Labour Party.
Anthony, I wanted to ask you, what do you think of the by-election results this week? Do they tell you that the red wall is changing?
You know, I think you can overlook, you can look too much at a by-election and think it's telling you more than it is. I think clearly there was a feeling in Wakefield of frustration with government, and people voted in that way. But no one in Wakefield thought they were voting for who was running the country. And that is the choice that's at a general election. And so obviously we need to reflect on the result as the Conservative Party and look at why those voters who, Louis said, turned away from us or stayed at home, in a very low turnout election. We need to look at why they did that and try and win back their trust. But we also need to reflect on the fact that in a by-election, more people will stay at home just because they see it as an opportunity to send a message to the government without actually changing who is in charge.
Yeah. Seb, what do you think of the by-election result? Was it a surprise to you?
Not really. So to just break down this sort of, I agree with Lou that actually these categories are great for people, for political journalists trying to make sweeping points, but they miss the nuances of every different seat. Now, Wakefield is one of the more urban red wall seats, and I always thought that whatever happened at the next election, that one would go back, because unlike, say, Antony's seat in Burnley, Wakefield is more diverse, because I think the red wall, broadly speaking, tends to be older white voters, whereas Wakefield is very much not the case of that. It's also geographically closer to a city. It's very close. It's 10 minutes on the train from Leeds.
It is a city.
Okay, it is a city. Sorry to anyone from Wakefield in the room. Beautiful cathedral there, I should say, which defines it as a city. They do very good scones there, in fact. But I mean, in terms of what we define as a modern economic base of a city, it's much closer than many of the other red wall seats. For example, be it Darlington or Bishop Auckland, they're much more rural, and it's the more rural red wall ones that will be more difficult to go back. So that's not really a surprise in that sense. But that 12.7% swing you talked about on a depressed turnout, yes, it might be good, but that's pretty much the same average swing Ed Miliband got in the by-elections during 2010 to 2015, and as we know, he went on to lose the next general election. So I think on the one sense, there is good news for Labour, in that you can actually win back seats in the red wall, and you've proven that now. But I don't think it necessarily looks at this structural change that my view of it is that the sort of the coalition the Labour Party was built on, which is working class voters and socialist intellectuals, that coalition was broken by Brexit. Now, you can build a new coalition, but you've got a lot more work to do that. And I think a lot of Wakefield was winning it based on the fact that people don't really like Boris Johnson, they don't like Boris Johnson's government. But are they actively voting for Labour? Are they actively going to Labour's message, which you might want to say more about what that is, because I find myself puzzled sometimes. And that's going to be the challenge for them winning back the red wall, because I think a lot of those places will say, OK, you know, I've sort of broken the seal, I've gone against Labour once, I could just do it again. Why should I go back?
So I was interested in your view on this, actually, Seb. So what do you think parties can offer red wall voters that will secure their vote? You know, you could answer that for each of the different parties, if you like. Well,
I'm going to put aside the Liberal Democrats for a moment, because I think it's fair to say that they're not getting a great hearing in the red wall at the moment, but obviously the blue wall is a different thing. Yeah. But in terms of Labour, the most compelling case I heard in my research was from Neil Kinnock, who talked about the politics of securitization. And essentially, the way you can look at it is that the traditional structures that defined these places, trade unions, a big employer, collectivized workforce, in fact, their whole lives were collectivized. They lived together, they socialized together, they went on the bus holiday together. everything about their livelihoods was about the Labour Party. That's now gone, and that's not just in the UK, of course, that's every developed economy. What Labour can say is OK, those structures may have gone, here are new structures, and the way that Lord Kinnock talked about this was security, so environmental security, talking about climate change, national security, NATO and the army, economic security in terms of 0 hours contracts and some of the elements of employment law. And that narrative is Labour basically saying, we're here to sort of give you protection from those pernicious elements of the market. So that's the Labour side. On the Tory side, I mean, Boris Johnson stood up outside Downing Street and said, you know, you put your trust in us, we'll repay that trust. We're sort of 3 years in, and I'm not sure a huge amount of it has been repaid at the moment. Now, obviously, we've had the coronavirus pandemic, which has been challenging, plus, obviously, the economic situation due to Ukraine. But I think, really, at best, there's 2 years left now to the next election. And I think the hope of this government would be is to focus on maybe 5 or 6 big things and actually prove you can deliver them, because I think at the moment there's been a lot of rhetoric from the government about, you know, building hospitals, changing high streets, tackling decades of decline, reversing railway cuts, bringing back buses. Is it happening? Are people actually seeing and feeling it? And at the moment, there's no coherent sense of that, and that's the challenge, I think, of what they'd have to do to try and hold on to as many of the red wall seats as possible.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask, you know, Boris Johnson was supposed to be at a conference organised by the Northern Research Group. Quite recently, a lot of your colleagues were very frustrated that he didn't make it. And as Seb was saying, there's some loss of trust in the Prime Minister. Are you concerned about losing votes?
I don't think. I think, actually, every...
Should he have been at that conference, though?
I think every Conservative MP, as well as all the other delegates there, recognised why he didn't turn up, right? I mean, it was the day he went to Kyiv. It was important ahead of this week at the G7 and the NATO summit that the Prime Minister's at now, that he went to Kyiv, met President Zelensky and had that conversation. But that same energy conference had the Chancellor of the Exchequer speak to the guests on the Thursday. It saw Michael Gove go and speak then. So, you know, yes, the Prime Minister didn't go, but he went. He didn't go for the right reasons, and there was significant buy-in from the very top of government. And if you'd said 2 or 3 years ago, the Conservative Party, a group of Conservative MPs, are going to hold a conference in Doncaster and get the Chancellor of the Exchequer and one of the most senior Secretary of State to come and speak and talk about how we rebalance the economy and turbocharge the North, I think most people would have said that's probably for the birds.
So 5 or 6 big ticket offers. What would you both suggest at this point? Obviously, we won't take them as party policy.
Well, I think the single biggest thing that we need to show that we can deliver at the next election is an improvement in living standards. If levelling up is to mean anything, it means people have to have more income and more pay. And the point about the thing that sort of unites the red wall, as Seb said, is deindustrialisation and the replacement of those well-paid, secure, unionised jobs with low-paid, insecure, low-skilled jobs and an absolute, you know, profligation of those types of jobs. If you look at towns, you know, in South Yorkshire like Barnsley and Rotherham that used to be dominated by the steelworks or the mines, they're now dominated by ASOS or Amazon warehouses that are on extremely low-paid, the types of jobs that, you know, you're called up to do in the morning and then you turn up to work and are told actually you're not needed and are sent home again. So being able to demonstrate that we can deliver jobs and investment and drive up people's pay, because over the last 10 years we've seen the slowest wage growth since in the Napoleonic era, and this year the biggest crash in living standards on record. So levelling up in that context is completely and utterly meaningless to the vast majority of people in these types of seats. And red wall voters have seen their pay fall by twice as fast as the average in the last 3 years as well. So a coherent economic offer on living standards and a credible agenda for change, because the vast majority of people in this country, particularly these types of voters, just do not believe that the status quo is working for them. So being able to credibly show that we can deliver change is really important. And I think one of our biggest assets for that, and it was shown in Wakefield, it's been shown in places like Greater Manchester, is where Labour is in power with our Labour mayors. And those Labour mayors have shown already that they're eating into that red wall vote as well. You know, Andy Burnham won in every ward in Greater Manchester. Tracy Brabin was very popular on the doors in Wakefield. So being able to show where we are in power, what we're already doing to deliver, I think gets us over the fact that we've been 12 years in opposition and people don't understand what we're kind of for or capable of delivering anymore. The other point I would just make is, because people are skint at the moment and really worrying about how they're going to pay their bills, what they were absolutely sick to death of was culture wars and attempts to divide. And during the by-election, you know, we had Rwanda and asylum arguments waging in the background, Northern Ireland and Brexit, the government trying to pin the rail strikes on the Labour Party, and it just did not work on the doors in Wakefield. And when people were struggling to pay their bills or struggling to get access to a GP appointment, the last thing they wanted to see was a government playing political games with really important issues like this. So I think it demonstrated, and it should give the Labour Party confidence that we can rise above these culture wars or so-called wedge issues and just focus relentlessly on the economic issues and the issues that matter to our voters.
Seb, when it comes to the culture wars, do you think the government is maintaining its connection with red wall voters by going to these so-called wedge issues, culture wars? What do you think?
Well, on the one hand, some of it is just classic electioneering, which is trying to find a way of doing something you've seen the Conservative Party do for much of the past 15 years, which is to find an issue that's difficult for Labour, try and paint Labour as being quite extreme, and then say we occupy the centre ground. And it's been pretty effective. It's why they've won the past 3 or 4 general elections. My view on this is that some of this is a misreading of the Red Wall. And my key point, and I've done the writings on this, is the Red Wall is not that different to the rest of the country. That many of these seats have become richer over the past 4 decades, you know, so to take Northwest Durham, which I know obviously, you know, are part of the world, yes. You know, Concert was horrific when the steelworks closed in 1981. The Evening Chronicle described it as the murder of a town. 36% of that town was unemployed. You know, can you imagine the devastating that effect had on every business in that area? So it went through some very bad times. But now when you go to Concert, it's changed a lot. You've got these big out-of-town private housing estates with 2 cars in the driveway. The biggest employer in Concert is a wine warehouse, and I went there, and the car park is full of Beamers and Audis, and, you know, the steelworkers didn't have Beamers and Audis when they were the biggest employer in the region. So if you were to look at Concert, and if you put that in Kent, it would look exactly the same, and Kent is very solidly Conservative. But of course, that's always had that legacy of voting Labour and that connection to the party. So this idea that you have to have this kind of march on institutions, an almost Marxist thing, I just don't think is right. Now, we are, in my view, a small C Conservative country that respects institutions, be it the BBC, the National Trust, and, well, I don't say dare I say, because everyone in this room will love it, but Channel 4 as well, in fact. And I think this idea that, you know, you have to attack those to hold those voters on side, I just don't think is right at all. People want to see institutions respected and maintained, and Parliament's including that as well, as the way that I think Parliament is treated by the executive sometimes. But at the same time, you know, there are issues where, for example, if you take some particular things about free speech or history, there is a space where I think, you know, it's more towards the Conservative side and the Labour side on this. But you know, is a statue of Winston Churchill going to win the next election? No.
Would you agree that the Conservatives at this point need to move away from pushing the culture wars to continue its connection with
one of the things that Louise said was one of the culture wars, which I actually don't think it is the government's policy on illegal migration in Rwanda. You know, that was never about a culture war. It's not about a culture war. It's about recognising a problem, and I can tell you from knocking on doors in Burnley, and in fact when I was knocking on doors in Wakefield, it was raised as a concern and an issue. So that's not a culture war, that's a government listening to what people say and then trying to find a workable policy to address it.
I mean,
I maintain that it's a workable policy, it's just not worked yet.
would you like to respond?
No, well, look, I don't accept that at all. I don't think it's a racist policy in the slightest. I think it is a legitimate way for the government to look to address the issue. It's a policy proposal that Labour considered at one point during its time in office. It's a policy proposal that the European countries are looking at. So I don't accept that criticism at all.
Louise, do you want to respond?
Well, I mean, bless. Say unworkable, just not worked yet. I mean, it's been, as you say, you know, Israel tried it. It comprehensively failed. Obviously, people smuggling and illegal immigration needs tackling. But the reason why people smuggling and these channel crossings are happening is because there aren't the safe and legal routes to asylum that should be in place. Unless you are Ukrainian or to a much lesser extent from Afghanistan, there is no way to access asylum in this country, and that should shame us as a country.
But did immigration come up on the doorstep, say, in Wakefield?
Genuinely, like I'm like reflecting on it now, absolutely nowhere near as much as it did in previous elections, and that's been a noticeable trend, I think, over the last few years, that it has come up less and less. But of course, at times of economic insecurity, it's always easy, I think, to overplay these issues, and there are, you know, forces in British politics that will seek to weaponise immigration in order to drive, you know, further insecurity. And I think we need to demonstrate you know, our traditional British values of compassion and welcoming those who are fleeing persecution, and that needs to be front and centre of any approach to immigration policy.
Okay, I'll move on to some areas of policy that Red Wall voters have been polled on and are specifically supportive of. A Survation poll of 44 constituencies in the north of England and Midlands, won by Conservatives from Labour in the 2019 election, found large majorities of both Tory and Labour voters in those seats supporting public ownership for main utilities, including energy, rail and water. But it sounds like from what your leader was saying a little earlier that that's not necessarily on your agenda anymore. Is that going to be... Are you worried about that the effect that might have on those constituencies?
So we are, as Shadow Transport Secretary, I've been pleased to recommit us to public ownership of rail. It is absolutely the common sense approach. The government have almost got us there, but not quite, and they've created this hybrid system that actually means that the taxpayer risks an awful lot of money on the railways, whilst private companies leech money out of the system to all of our expense. So for the next...
Which is the public ownership agenda, do you think that's key to target in
I think it's part of it, but I think... I didn't hear Keir speak earlier, but I imagine what he was talking about was priorities. And for us, rail is a priority because it's a key investment area, and it's a way for us to both deliver a better service and actually deliver better value for money. But I think what was clear at the last election was by promising to do too much and deliver absolutely everything that, of course, a dream Labour government would like to do, it just didn't seem credible. So, you know, socialism is the language of priorities. And I think, as I say, I didn't hear Keir speak earlier, but I imagine what he was saying was we need to be very clear what our priorities are at the next election. And public ownership, of course, remains a value of the Labour Party, but we need to be credible in what we're offering to the electorate.
Do you hear it from your voters in Burnley? Are they keen on a public ownership agenda?
It doesn't come up very often, and now that might be because they know as a Conservative knocking on their door, you know, I'm probably not going to be one to advocate public ownership. I think what people want and expect is, you know, to pay a fair price for a fair service, and you definitely get frustration from people when they see their energy bills going up or the water bills going up. I think that's fair, and we should, you know, we should reflect on people's concerns and how we can address them. But it's, you know, since I became the MP, I've not had anyone on the doorstep say, "Will you commit to renationalising the utility companies?"
And another area that they found large support for in the Red Wall was, you know, perhaps unsurprisingly, large support for a £15 minimum wage and a 4-day working week. There are going to be some difficult conversations that you're going to need to have at the next election, I would imagine.
Yeah, I would think so. Okay. The minimum wage, you know, has increased and will continue to increase. I don't know in the Survation poll what timeline they put on it. But again, I mean, not a surprise that people want to see the money in their pocket increase, and that's what everyone should want and expect. The 4-day working week, I think, is an interesting one. I think there's some businesses at the minute trialling it to see if it works. Ultimately, I think that should be a process that is led by businesses first to figure out if productively the economy can move in that direction.
Did wages and come up in the Wakefield
Yeah, of
by-election?
course, and that's we've seen that last week with the rail industrial action, and that is going to be the sort of tip of the iceberg in terms of industrial action over the coming months as pay becomes a real crisis point for a lot of a huge section of the workforce. The BA workers had their pay cut by 10% during the pandemic, and all they're doing is asking for that to be restored now. So we're going to see increasing industrial action over that, because we're in the middle of an inflationary crisis, and the government's only response to that, all people hear, is not to ask for a pay rise. They don't have a strategy to bring down inflation and to make sure that people have more money in their pocket and can afford their bills. So in the absence of that, of course, people are going to be fighting for more pay, and we need to see a proper, genuine living wage. It's not good enough that the minimum wage is not enough for people to live on.
And I want to ask another question. Other polling has found that 70% of adults who want levelling up have said they would be happy if it was delivered in 3 years, but that decreased to 37% who said were it to take 5 years. Isn't there a level of urgency that you're finding in red wall seats then? And, are you worried that patience might run out if your levelling up agenda continues to not
I think
deliver?
there is absolutely a level of urgency. I think people have heard us talk about this for a few years now. People gave some latitude during the COVID pandemic because they recognised we couldn't do everything, but the government absolutely has to focus. To Seb's point earlier, the government needs to start focusing what it's doing, because we can't do all things all the time. The focus for the next 2-3 years has to be delivering the things we've said, whether that's getting the bus strategy to go from paper onto routes, or addressing the private rented sector, which the Prime Minister spoke about the other week. But yeah, delivery is everything in politics. We can spend a lot of time talking about policies that will change people's lives, but if we never actually deliver on those policies, then we've missed a fundamental opportunity.
Are you finding that support for levelling up is going to fall if it's going the longer it takes?
Well, the problem is, what is levelling up? I mean, there's that wonderful 390-page white paper, and I genuinely mean that. I'm probably the only person in this room who read the whole damn thing. And
I've read it, Seb.
I'm sure. But the point is, within that, I'm just joking, of course, there is a really good, cogent analysis of the problems in our country, and it's the first serious attempt to look at why 17.4 million people voted for Brexit and wanted a fundamental change. The issue is you've got a great analysis, but not much has happened on delivery and trying to change that. Now, of course, again, you can talk about the pandemic and Ukraine and the economic situation. That may all be true, but that doesn't mean anything for the people who voted Tory in 2019 for a big change within their lives. And I think it's Michael Gove is obviously the Secretary of State for levelling up, but I feel like that department has not really grasped it and been able to give a coherent message of what levelling up looks and feels like. And until voters get that, then they'll feel their trust that they put into the Tories has not been repaid. Just to come back to some of the stuff we're talking about individual policies and what is not isn't popular. A lot of this stuff is polling questions that I think of the would you like a pony, which if I said, would you like a pony, you would say, sure, why not? I'd say, would you like a pony stables to clean up its manure and feed it every day? You say, maybe not. And I think when you look at some of these individual policies about nationalised railways, people think, yes, nationalised, it'll be cheaper, quicker and run better. But again, when you unpack what certain elements we mean of nationalisation, might not necessarily get the same result for that there. And I think what will be interesting, Lou, to come back to your points, we've got this huge reorganisation of the railways taking place with Great British Railways coming in next year. It'll be very interesting to see how that changes, because I actually think, and you will disagree with this, rail privatisation in terms of passenger numbers has actually been a huge success. From the mid-1990s, up to that point, the railways were in decline, whereas passenger numbers have risen hugely since then. We've seen some fantastic infrastructure projects, not just obviously Crossrail, but also High Speed 1. High Speed 2 is being built now, new rolling stock across the railways. Now, obviously, there are still issues, capacity issues, and that's why we need to get on with HS2. But I think the issue for Labour is saying, if we're going to nationalise it, to what end? Do you want cheaper fares? How are you going to subsidise that? Do you want more built? How are you going to subsidise that? And I think too much in our debate, we just have this kind of nationalisation good, privatisation bad, with no specifics of what it actually means for either of those options.
Yeah, and I think that's why we need to think about public ownership or as a way to deliver for passengers. And for too long, except passenger numbers have come up, but passengers have not been at the heart of delivering, you know, this rail network. Fares have gone up twice as fast as wages. Outside London and the South East, you know, the vast majority of people just cannot or do not rely on the rail. It's overcrowded, delayed, and very, very poor rolling stock. We've not seen the investment that we should have done on electrification, for example. You know, the Midland Main Line track between Sheffield and London has been promised for 12 years.
Four
times over 12 years, exactly. So, yes, you know, of course we've seen some investment and some improvement, but we need to see it reformed. And as you say, just like with Levelling Up, the Shapps-Williams paper delivers the analysis but doesn't quite go there in the full delivery. And I would say it's because you know, we actually share a lot of analysis of where it's gone wrong, but the government are ideologically incapable of delivering on the solutions, and particularly the coalition that they have built. You know, that is what's been revealed now. There is no economic ideology that can hold that coalition together, and that's why it's now starting to splinter.
I want to move on to some of the questions that our audience has. 2 minutes, Rachel. Okay, right, I'll come to you first on that. Can the Conservatives have an agenda that addresses both the blue and red walls, and similarly could Labour, or do you have to prioritise? Essentially, you have to go red or blue. What do you think?
Well, I think, I mean, as Seb sort of characterised it earlier, you know, our traditional coalition spans demographics and spans economic bands, and it has concentrated in the last couple of elections in quite high earners, actually. You know, we've lost our traditional working class vote, but we can see that we are making inroads back into it. And I think because now there is a genuine cost of living crisis. I think when Ed Miliband tried to prosecute that in sort of 2014, 2015, it didn't really ring true for that many voters. People didn't feel as sort of economically insecure, and particularly not as a result of government policies, whereas now the vast majority of voters, I think, are forgiving of the government to a certain extent and will accept that, of course, there are global factors in the current inflationary crisis with COVID and Ukraine, but the vast majority of voters believe that the government should and could be doing much more. And I think if we can deliver a credible agenda for change and challenging the status quo, but also driving living standards, then that will go a long way to helping rebuild that coalition that we've held in the past.
Okay, thank you. I'll let you, I'll let you run off. Thank you. Similarly, Anthony, can I ask you the same question? Do you think your party has to prioritise the red wall or the blue wall?
No, I don't think we do have to prioritise. I think, you know, the 2019 election... the 2019 election showed that it is possible to build a broad voter coalition. And actually, you know, the Levelling Up agenda is a good example of how you do it, because addressing regional imbalance between north, south, east, west isn't something that should divide us, right? I mean, if you live in the southeast, if you live in London, you should want to see a powerful, prosperous northwest and vice versa. So I think it is possible, but to the point I made earlier, it's difficult, and we've got to see the delivery of it.
I think this is a really interesting question. Has the growth of new media platforms like GB News and Talk TV shaped opinion in the red wall or reflected it, or neither?
I mean,
it's your area of expertise as a journalist.
Indeed. I think if you were to look at maybe their viewership numbers, that maybe sort of speaks for themselves in terms of their influence they have there. Look, obviously I've been a journalist for 12 years, and I just love more media, and I think having more people employing journalists is always a good thing. What's that?
I said here.
Yeah, exactly. But in terms of shaping opinion, like, I think one thing that is interesting in some of those red wall places is the fact that they probably don't engage with mainstream media in a way other parts of the country do. They're less likely to read, say, The Times or The Guardian, or even the New Statesman, in fact. But a lot of their media comes through Facebook and through Facebook group sharing. I remember Phil Wilson, the former Labour MP for Sedgefield, said to me, and he's been canvassing in Sedgefield since 1979 and worked closely when Tony Blair was the MP, and he later became the MP in 2007. And he said in the 70s and 80s, there was always a set level of facts from the local newspaper, from the local BBC. And in his words, by 2019, people were just telling me shite they read off Facebook. And I think, and there is this clear thing of people getting a lot of their news from those kind of curated feeds. And we shouldn't underestimate, between the 2017 election and 2019, Facebook had that massive algorithm change in terms of, in 17, promoting news stories, and in 19 it was promoting, you know, memes of cats or something. And I think in a way that did very much influence people's thoughts on this. So even though the business models of GB News and Talk TV and Talk Radio and the rest of it is viral social media content, the primary platform for those voters, Facebook, is not sharing that to the same extent.
Okay, and the question about Jeremy Corbyn. How much was Jeremy Corbyn responsible for Labour's red wall losses, do you think?
Yeah, he was definitely a big factor. You know, I mean, the things that came up almost every day during the 2019 election was Jeremy Corbyn and Brexit. But it wasn't the only factor, because those two things existed in 2017 as well. So yes, Jeremy Corbyn was a factor, but the thing that I think pushed us over the line was, one, you know, the absolute paralysis in politics and Parliament, but also I think it was this idea of rebalancing the economy, which we didn't have in 2017, and that voters are now really holding us accountable for. So, you know, Corbyn, absolutely a factor, but it was in 2017 and never got the Tories over that majority line.
I think just to come in on that, I mean, the three factors to the 2019 were obviously Brexit, the fact that a lot of people just wanted it done. And the key thing about that Get Brexit Done message, it appealed to Remainers as well as Brexit, people who were just fed up with people talking about this over and over again. Mr Corbyn was a factor, you know, to put it quite bluntly, you know, if you want to create a caricature of a Labour leader to not appeal to the Red Wall, you would get Mr Corbyn in terms of his persona, his policies and his track record, and also the fact he was quite an ineffectual Labour leader, and that for me was the big change between 2017 and 2019. In 2017, he ran a very good election campaign with a very clear slogan, was very good at all those rallies that you and I covered. By 2019, it felt like he was being buffeted by events, and the fact was, on the single biggest issue of the day, he didn't have a policy. Like, I mean, I still can't even remember what exactly Labour's Brexit policy was. It was kind of get a deal and then maybe put it to a referendum. And people just looked at this and thought, hang on a minute, he doesn't really stand for anything. How can he lead the country if he can't lead his party?
There's a really interesting question, and most popular question. There is a drug overdose death epidemic in so-called left behind areas. Shouldn't drug policy reform be a part of levelling up? Yeah, I can think of some examples in the northeast where there's certainly this problem. Yeah,
so I'm not in favour of you know, if we talk about drug reform as legalisation and stuff, not at all something I'm in favour of. You know, we see in Burnley the impact that has on families and lives. But what I do want to see is a much tougher police approach. And actually, if you go to places like Burnley, where the police have historically over the last 10 years taken their eye off the ball a little bit, we're now seeing that totally reversed. And you know, I remember when I first got elected and I would talk to the police about how they tackled drugs in the town centre, and you could go into a pub or a nightclub and it was clear that drugs were being sold there. That approach is fundamentally different now. It has gone far further on the enforcement side. So you know, I don't think the way we tackle the drug problem in places like Burnley and other places, you know, up in the northeast, is by legalising or changing it like that. I think it's by showing people that if you are caught with drugs, then you're going to be punished accordingly.
You spent a lot of time in these communities and families that have dealt with this kind of problem. What do you think a drug policy reform message would go down with them? Like?
I think, broadly speaking, it needs to be about localised policy and not set at a national Whitehall level. That I think far too much about how the NHS is run is done from a Mandarin on Victoria Street and not enough within these local communities. And different parts of the country have very different drug issues. You know, some places it's Class A, some places it's long-term habitual use of less serious drugs, all of which have big societal impacts. So I would want to see it devolved and allow local NHS leads to decide what works for them. Broadly speaking, I think that there's a case to be had about where you do at the lower end of the scale, but I think fundamentally, I think there is an issue about police and the fact as well, obviously, you know, 20,000 police were cut. There's now 20,000 more police coming back in. And so many of the problems in these areas can be traced back to what happened in 2010, 2015, where local governments were cut, strategic capacity was lost, and a lot of those community support assets were cut back. And essentially, they're now all just being come back in again. And you can look at the Brexit referendum one way and just say that was a referendum against austerity in many respects. And the result of that is the Tory party just spending loads of money to undo what they did before that.
I'll finish on this last question. Will the concept of the Red Wall exist past the next election?
Yeah, I think it will. I think there was a fundamental shift in British politics. I think the Brexit referendum allowed people, as I said earlier, to reflect on how they'd voted throughout their lives. You know, you would knock on so many doors and people would say, my parents voted Labour, my grandparents voted Labour, I've always voted Labour, but now I'm looking at changing it for the first time. Now, the challenge for us as a Conservative Party is to make that stick, to allow people, to give people that positive choice, to say you made the right choice in 2019 and stick with us in the next election and subsequent elections. But I think that is fundamentally an achievable mission. And so, you know, I see the new blue wall up in the north of England.
Okay, Seb, you're not allowed to mention your book.
No.
Will the concept of the Red Wall exist past the next election?
What will exist is that the Conservative Party is not going back to a world before 2060, no matter how much Jeremy Hunt would like it to. The fact is that the Conservative voting coalition is now going to be pro-Brexit, older, more working class. You know, 48% of C to D voters voted Conservative at the last election. Even at the height of Thatcherism, that was only 41%. So this really is a big shift. And the Tory party, I think, has to acknowledge and realise that. So are they appealing to those kind of voters? Yes. Are lots of them in the North and Midlands? Yes. Will we still be talking about the Red Wall? Well, I certainly hope so.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. I'd just like to say thank you to Seb and Anthony.